So, the little girl didn't look at the 5 elegant women standing in the marble hall. She looked at the maid. For a moment, no one breathed. Crystal chandeliers hung above them, glowing softly over the polished black floor. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun painted the gardens gold. But inside the Bellini mansion, the air had suddenly turned heavy. 8-year-old Sofia Bellini slowly walked across the enormous room, past 5 women dressed in designer gowns, past diamond necklaces, and polished smiles, past perfume that smelled like wealth. She walked straight toward the woman standing quietly near the kitchen door. The maid, Maria Alvarez, froze, her hands still holding a tray of teacups. Sofia reached for her hand and said the words that would shake the entire room. "I choose her." Gasps echoed through the hall. Victoria Sinclair's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Rebecca Shaw almost laughed out loud. Claudia Romano looked offended, like someone had insulted her family. Name. Danielle Hart leaned toward Isabella Costa and whispered, "This must be some kind of joke," but it wasn't. Because across the room, Marco Bellini was watching, and Marco Bellini never arranged jokes. He stood beside the fireplace in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Tall, broad-shouldered, calm. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. People listened when Marco Bellini spoke, even when he whispered. Right now, though, he wasn't whispering. He was silent. His dark eyes studied his daughter carefully. Then they moved to the maid. Maria looked terrified. "Sir?" "Don't understand," she stammered. Sofia held her hand tighter, but the 5 wealthy women had already begun reacting. Victoria Sinclair let out a short laugh. "This is ridiculous." She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and looked at Marco. "You can't seriously expect us to compete with household staff." Rebecca crossed her arms. "She's a child, Marco. Surely this isn't how you're making a life decision." Claudia Romano stepped forward slightly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "My father is a senator," she said coolly. "Our families have known each other for years. This situation can't possibly be serious." Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at Sofia. His voice was calm. "Come here, sweetheart." Sofia didn't move. She stayed beside Maria. That alone surprised him. Sofia had always obeyed him instantly. But today was different. "Why her?" Marco asked quietly. Sofia looked up at him. Her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, were steady. "Because she's kind." The room went still again. Victoria scoffed softly. "Kind?" she repeated. Sofia nodded. "She talks to me." Rebecca frowned. "Everyone talked to you today." Sofia shook her head. "No, you talked at me." The comment landed harder than anyone expected. Even Marco felt it, because Sofia wasn't wrong. All afternoon the women had been trying to impress her, not understand her. Marco remembered the moment 5 weeks earlier when everything in his world had changed. The hospital room had smelled like antiseptic and quiet sadness. Elena Bellini lay pale against white sheets, her breathing shallow. Marco sat beside her bed, holding her hand like it was the most fragile thing in the world. Elena had been the only person who ever saw Marco Bellini as more than a powerful man. She saw the tired father behind the empire, the man behind the legend. "Take care of her," Elena had whispered weakly. Marco squeezed her hand. "I will," but Elena had shaken her head slightly. "Not just protect her," she said softly. "Understand her." That promise had stayed with him. And now, weeks later, Marco was realizing something uncomfortable. Maybe Sofia understood people better than he did. Back in the hall, the tension continued to grow. Danielle Hart finally spoke. "This is inappropriate," she said sharply. "You invited us here under very, different expectations." Marco finally looked at the 5 women. His voice remained calm. "I invited you here for honesty." Rebecca gestured toward Maria. "That woman is a housekeeper." Maria lowered her eyes, clearly wishing she could disappear. But Sofia didn't let go of her hand. Marco noticed that. Then he asked Sofia something carefully. "What makes her different?" Sofia thought for a moment. Then she said something that made every adult in the room uncomfortable. "When Mama died, Everyone, stop talking to me. The words hit like cold water. Sophia continued quietly. Everyone whispered around me, or sent me to my room. She looked down at the floor, but Maria didn't. Maria looked shocked. Sophia continued. She sat with me when I cried. Marco slowly turned his head toward the maid. Maria swallowed nervously. I didn't mean to overstep, sir, she said quickly. She was just alone. Sophia nodded. She makes me hot chocolate at night. Victoria rolled her eyes. Oh, for heaven's sake. But Marco wasn't listening to Victoria anymore. He was watching Maria carefully. Is that true? He asked. Maria nodded nervously. Yes, sir. Sometimes she can't sleep. Sophia squeezed her hand. She tells me stories about her grandmother. Maria looked embarrassed. They're just silly childhood stories, she murmured. But Sophia shook her head. They're not silly. Marco felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, because he suddenly realized something disturbing. He had been so busy protecting Sophia from the outside world, he hadn't noticed how alone she had been inside the house. Vincent Russo stepped closer beside Marco and whispered quietly, Well, this is unexpected. Marco didn't respond. His eyes were still on Sophia. The 5 wealthy women were growing impatient. Claudia Romano finally spoke again. This entire process is humiliating. Victoria nodded. We're accomplished women, Marco. Business leaders, influencers. Rebecca added sharply, and we're being evaluated, by a grieving child. Marco finally turned toward them. His gaze was cold now. Exactly. The words silenced them. You came here hoping to become part of my family, Marco continued calmly. But none of you asked my daughter how she felt. No one spoke, because they hadn't. They had talked about wealth, connections, education, power, everything except Sophia. Marco looked down at his daughter again. You're sure? He asked softly. Sophia nodded immediately. Yes. Then she said something that made Maria's eyes fill with tears. She already feels like family. The room was quiet again. Marco Bellini, the man who controlled millions of dollars and commanded armies of loyal men, felt something shift deep inside him. Because in that moment, his daughter had just forced him to see the truth about the people around him. And the truth was about to create a decision that would shock the entire city. But what none of them realized yet was that Sophia's choice would soon reveal a secret about Maria Tarr, that no one, not even Marco, was prepared to discover. Marco Bellini didn't respond right away. The entire hall waited. 5 powerful women stood in expensive silence, their expressions shifting between irritation and disbelief. The maid looked like she might faint, and Sophia simply held Maria's hand, like she had already made the only decision that mattered. Marco slowly walked across the marble floor. Each step echoed through the room. When he stopped, he stood directly in front of Maria. Up close, she looked even more nervous. Her dark hair was tied in a simple bun, and her uniform was spotless but plain. She avoided looking him in the eye. Maria, Marco said calmly. Yes, sir. How long have you worked here? 3 years, and before that, I worked in a hotel housekeeping department in Queens. Her voice trembled slightly, but she answered honestly. Marco studied her face carefully. Years of running a criminal empire had taught him how to read people. Fear, lies, desperation, greed. He saw none of those things in Maria, just anxiety, and something else, genuine concern for Sophia. Behind him, Victoria Sinclair finally lost patience. This is unbelievable, she said sharply. You're entertaining this fantasy? Marco didn't even turn around. My daughter made a choice. Rebecca stepped forward. A child's choice is not a binding decision, Marco. Marco finally looked back at the women. You came here to impress me, he said calmly. Claudia crossed her arms. Of course we did, but you never tried to understand her. Danielle sighed dramatically. She's 8. Marco's voice lowered slightly. Exactly. The room grew quiet again, because the meaning behind his tone was clear. An 8-year-old child had shown more awareness than 5 powerful adults. Maria finally spoke carefully. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Marco looked back at her. You think so? Yes, she said quickly. Sophia is upset. She lost her mother. I was only trying to comfort her. That doesn't mean Sophia interrupted. It means everything. Maria looked down at the girl. Sophia, you stayed with me when everyone else was busy, Sophia said quietly. Maria didn't know what to say. Marco noticed that Maria still hadn't tried to take advantage of the moment. She hadn't smiled proudly or acted pleased. She looked terrified. That alone told him a lot. Vincent Russo stepped closer again and murmured near Marco's shoulder. You're really considering this? Marco answered quietly. I'm considering why she chose her. Vincent glanced at Maria. She's a maid. Marco's eyes stayed on his daughter. She's someone my daughter trusts. Across the hall, Victoria grabbed her purse. I'm not standing here for this nonsense. Claudia followed her lead. My father will hear about this. Rebecca added coldly. You're making a very strange decision, Marco. Marco's gaze shifted toward them again. Then perhaps you're free to leave. That ended the discussion. One by one, the women turned and walked toward the exit. Their heels clicked angrily against the marble as they left the mansion. Danielle was the last to leave. She paused near the door and looked back. You're letting a child choose your wife. Marco's expression didn't change. I'm letting my daughter choose who belongs in her life. Danielle shook her head and walked out. The giant doors closed. Silence filled the hall again. Now only 4 people remained. Marco, Anvesa, Maria, looked completely overwhelmed. Sir, I really think I should go back to work. Marco raised a hand slightly. Stay. She froze again. Sophia still held her hand tightly. Marco knelt slightly so he was at eye level with his daughter. Sweetheart, he said gently, choosing someone to be part of our family is a very big decision. Sophia nodded. I know. You understand what that means? Yes. Marco studied her carefully. What do you think it means? Sophia thought for a moment. It means she stays. Maria's eyes widened. Sophia continued. She eats dinner with us. Marco's expression softened slightly. And? She won't leave when I'm sad. The words landed heavily in the quiet hall. Marco slowly stood up again. His gaze moved back to Maria. You've helped my daughter through something very difficult. Maria shook her head quickly. I only did what anyone would do. Marco knew that wasn't true. Many people avoided emotional pain, especially in houses like his, but Maria, hadn't. Vincent spoke up again. Marco, we should discuss this privately. Marco nodded once. Maria, he said calmly, please take Sophia to the garden for a few minutes. Maria hesitated. Yes, sir. Sophia looked disappointed. Am I in trouble? Marco's voice softened. No. He gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. You did something brave today. Sophia smiled faintly. Then she walked toward the garden doors with Maria. Once they disappeared outside, Vincent turned to Marco. This can't be serious. Marco walked slowly toward the window. Outside, he could see Sophia sitting on the garden bench, while Maria spoke softly with her. Vincent continued. You're one of the most powerful men in the city. You don't marry a housekeeper because your daughter likes her. Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Sophia laugh quietly at something Maria said. That sound hadn't been heard in the mansion for weeks. Marco finally spoke. When Elena died, he said quietly, Sophia stopped laughing. Vincent didn't interrupt, but today, Marco continued. She laughed. Vincent sighed. That doesn't mean Maria should become your wife. Marco turned slightly. Who said anything about marriage? Vincent frowned. Then what are you thinking? Marco looked back out the window again. I'm thinking my daughter found the one person in this house who truly cares about her. Vincent rubbed his forehead. You're opening a door that will create gossip everywhere. Marco shrugged slightly. Let them talk. Vincent studied him carefully. You're not doing this because of Sophia alone. Marco didn't answer, but Vincent knew him too well. What are you thinking? Vincent asked. Marco watched Maria carefully as she adjusted Sophia's jacket against the cool breeze. I'm thinking, Marco said slowly, that sometimes the quietest person in the room knows the most. Vincent narrowed his eyes. You suspect something? Marco's voice was calm again. I suspect there's more to Maria, say, Alvarez than a cleaning uniform. Vincent blinked. What makes you say that? Marco turned away from the window. Because she never once looked impressed by this house. Vincent thought about that. It was true. Most people walked into the Bellini mansion and immediately looked overwhelmed. Maria never did. Marco continued quietly. And she didn't look excited when Sofia chose her. So, Marco's eyes hardened slightly. She looked worried. Vincent crossed his arms. You think she's hiding something? Marco walked toward the garden doors slowly. I always assume people are. Outside, Sofia suddenly ran across the grass, laughing as Maria chased her gently. Marco watched them both. For the first time in weeks, the mansion didn't feel empty. But Marco Bellini had survived decades in a dangerous world by trusting one rule. Nothing was ever as simple as it appeared, and soon he would discover that the quiet maid his daughter trusted carried a secret that could change everything. Next morning, Marco Bellini woke earlier than usual. The Bellini mansion was quiet, the way it always was before sunrise. Most of the staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, and the city outside was still wrapped in the gray calm of early morning. Marco stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. Maria Alvarez didn't know he was there. She stood at the stove in her usual uniform, quietly stirring hot chocolate in a small saucepan. Across the table, Sofia sat swinging her legs while drawing something on a sheet of paper. You added too much cinnamon again, Sofia said with a small smile. Maria laughed softly. You always say that. Because you always do it. Maria poured the drink into a mug and slid it across the table. Sofia took a sip and made an exaggerated face. See? Maria chuckled. You still drank half of it. From the doorway, Marco observed silently. He had spent years studying people for signs of deception, but this moment didn't feel staged. It felt natural, comfortable. Real. Sofia suddenly looked up and saw him. Papa. Maria jumped slightly, clearly embarrassed to be caught chatting instead of working. Mr. Bellini. Marco stepped into the kitchen. It's fine. Maria quickly straightened. I was just making her breakfast. Sofia held up her drawing. Look what I made. Marco walked over. The drawing showed 3 people holding hands. A tall man, a little girl, and a woman. The woman had long dark hair. Marco studied the picture quietly. Then Sofia pointed proudly. Tats Maria. Maria immediately looked uncomfortable. Sofia, honey, but Marco surprised them both. It's a nice drawing. Sofia smiled. Maria looked down at the counter. Marco watched her carefully again. She seemed genuinely uneasy about being included in Sofia's life so openly. Not proud, not manipulative, just cautious. That alone made Marco more curious. Maria, he said calmly, walk with me. She looked nervous. Yes, sir. They stepped outside into the garden. While Sofia stayed behind finishing breakfast, the morning air was cool and the grass was still wet with dew. Maria kept her hands folded nervously. You wanted to speak with me? Marco nodded. You've worked here 3 years. Yes. And before that, you lived in Queens. Yes, sir. Marco stopped walking. Then he asked something unexpected. What were you doing before the hotel job? Maria froze. For the first time since the conversation began, her expression changed. Not fear. Something deeper. Like a memory she didn't want to touch. Helped my grandmother. Marco watched her closely. Doing what? She ran a small bakery. Marco studied her face. Where? Maria hesitated. Brooklyn. Marco's instincts sharpened. Which neighborhood? Maria looked away slightly. Red Hook. Marco said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. I see. Maria looked confused. You do? Marco continued walking again. Red Hook is not an easy place to grow up. No, she admitted quietly. Say. They walked a few more steps before Marco spoke again. My daughter trusts you. Maria nodded. She's a sweet girl. She's also observant. Maria smiled faintly. Yes. Marco stopped again. And she sees something in you. Maria looked confused. I'm not sure what that means. Marco turned toward her fully. It means I need to understand who you are. Maria stiffened slightly. I'm just a housekeeper. Marco shook his head. No one is just anything. The wind moved gently through the trees, say, around them. Maria seemed to be choosing her words carefully. I've never tried to interfere with your family, Mr. Bellini. I know. I only helped Sofia because she was hurting. Marco believed that. But something still didn't add up. He had spent his life dealing with people who hid things. Maria wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling everything either. Before he could press further, Vincent Russo appeared on the garden path. He looked serious. Marco, he said quietly. Marco glanced at him. What is it? Vincent looked briefly at Maria. Maybe we should talk inside. Marco nodded once. Maria, thank you. She quickly returned to the house. As soon as she was out of earshot, Vincent spoke. I ran a background check. Marco raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Vincent shrugged. You asked me to look into her. Marco folded his arms. What did you find? Vincent hesitated. That's the strange part. Marco waited. There's almost nothing. Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. No. Okay. Criminal record, Vincent said. No major employment history before the hotel job. That's not unusual. Vincent shook his head. But there should be school records, tax records. Something. Marco remained calm. And Vincent handed him a small folder. This is everything. Marco opened it. Inside were only a few pages. Basic identification, work history starting 3 years ago. But before that, almost nothing. Marco looked up slowly. You're telling me this woman basically appeared out of Solder? Nowhere? Vincent nodded. Exactly. Marco closed the folder thoughtfully. And you think that's suspicious? Vincent gave him a look. You run one of the most powerful organizations in the city. A mysterious woman suddenly working in your house is definitely suspicious. Marco looked back toward the mansion. Through the kitchen window he could see Sofia laughing while Maria wiped flour from the counter. Maybe, Marco said. Vincent frowned. You're not concerned? Marco answered quietly. So, curious. Vincent crossed his arms. There's more. Marco waited. Vincent lowered his voice. I had someone check Red Hook, and there was a bakery. Marco's attention sharpened. Owned by her grandmother. Yes. So? Vincent hesitated again. The bakery burned down. Marco's expression didn't change. Accident? Vincent shook his head slowly. No. Marco closed the folder again. What happened? Vincent spoke carefully. It was arson. The wind moved through the garden again. Marco said, so. Nothing for a moment. Vincent continued. The grandmother died in the fire. Marco looked toward the house again. Maria was now helping Sofia wash her hands at the sink. She never mentioned that, Marco said. Vincent nodded. No. Marco's voice remained calm. What year? 6 years ago. Marco thought for a moment. Anyone arrested? Vincent shook his head. The case went cold. Marco's eyes darkened slightly, and Maria disappeared shortly after. Yes. Vincent studied him carefully. You see? The problem? Marco nodded slowly. A woman with a missing past, working in your home, Vincent finished. Marco looked down at the folder again. Then he said something surprising, or hiding from something. Vincent frowned. You're defending her? Marco shook his head. I'm considering possibilities. Vincent sighed. You want me to dig deeper? Marco closed the folder completely. Yes. Vincent started to walk away but paused. And Sofia? Marco looked back at the kitchen window. If so, daughter was smiling again. For now, Marco said quietly, we watch. Vincent nodded. But neither of them realized something important. Inside the kitchen, Maria had accidentally glanced through the garden window during their conversation, and the look on her face showed one terrifying truth. She knew exactly what Marco had just discovered, and the secret she had buried 6 years ago was about to catch up with her. Maria didn't sleep that night. The Bellini mansion was silent, but her mind wasn't. She sat on the small bed in her modest staff room, staring at the faint light coming through the window. Her hands were clasped tightly together. She had seen Marco and Vincent in the garden earlier. She hadn't heard every word, but she had heard enough. The bakery burned down. Arson. She disappeared. Maria closed her eyes. 6 years of silence, and now the past was knocking on the door again. She had known this day might come, but she never expected it to come here. Not in this house. Not with Sophia. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Maria quickly stood up. Yes? The door opened slightly. Sophia peeked inside. Her hair was messy, and she was holding her stuffed rabbit. I can't sleep. Maria softened immediately. You're supposed to be in bed. Sophia walked inside anyway. You tell better bedtime stories than the nannies. Maria smiled despite the tension inside her chest. That's because my stories are boring. They're not. Sophia climbed onto the bed and curled up beside her like she had done many times before. Maria gently pulled the blanket around her. What story tonight? Sophia thought for a moment. The bakery one. Maria froze. The one about your grandma. Maria swallowed slowly. That's not a very happy story. I like it. Maria looked down at the child resting beside her. For the past 3 years, Sophia had slowly become the center of her quiet world. The one bright light in a life she had tried to keep small and invisible. Okay, Maria whispered, and she began. My grandmother owned a little bakery by the docks. Sophia smiled. You always say it smelled like cinnamon. It did. And chocolate. Yes. Sophia's voice grew sleepy. Did people like it? Maria's eyes filled slightly. They loved it. But the story stopped there. Because the rest of it, the fire, the screams, the smoke, Maria couldn't say those parts. After a few minutes, Sophia fell asleep beside her. Maria gently brushed hair away from the girl's face. I'm sorry, she whispered softly. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maria looked up. Marco Bellini stood in the doorway. He had heard the story. Maria's heart stopped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Marco stepped quietly into the room. His voice was calm. You should have told me. Maria slowly stood up, careful not to wake Sophia. I didn't think it mattered. Marco glanced at the sleeping girl. It matters when someone's past suddenly disappears. Maria looked down. Yes. Marco leaned against the wall. The bakery burned down. Maria nodded slowly. Yes. Your grandmother died. Her voice trembled slightly. Yes. Marco watched her carefully. But that's not the whole story. Maria didn't answer. Marco continued quietly. Someone burned it. Silence filled the room. Maria finally spoke. Yes. Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you know who? Maria's hands tightened together. Yes. The word hung in the air. Marco straightened slightly. Woe? Maria looked directly at him. So, for the first time since the conversation began, and said something neither of them expected. Your enemies. Marco's expression changed. Explain. Maria took a slow breath. My grandmother refused to sell the bakery. To who? A man named Carlo De Luca. Marco's eyes hardened instantly. He knew that name. Carlo De Luca had once run a rival operation on the Brooklyn docks. Years ago, before Marco's organization had pushed them out. De Luca's people were forcing small businesses to sell. Maria continued quietly. My grandmother refused. Marco's voice was colder now, and they burned the place down. Maria nodded. They wanted to make an example. Marco looked toward the sleeping Sophia again, then back at Maria. And you disappeared. Yes. Why? Maria's voice broke slightly. Because I testified. Marco blinked. You testified against them? Yes. Vincent suddenly appeared behind Marco in the doorway, clearly surprised. That's impossible, Vincent said. There was never a witness. Maria looked at him. That's because the police moved me. Marco understood immediately. Witness protection. Maria nodded. For a year, Vincent frowned. But De Luca's organization collapsed years ago. Marco answered quietly. I made sure of it. Maria looked at him. I know. That surprised him. You know? Maria nodded. When the trial ended, I started hearing things. People said Marco Bellini destroyed De Lucas Empire. Marco watched her carefully. So you came here. Maria shook. So. Her head quickly. No. I applied for housekeeping jobs everywhere. This house was just one of them. Vincent crossed his arms. You're telling us this is coincidence? Maria looked exhausted. Yes. Marco studied her face and realized something important. She wasn't lying. She had never intended to come into his life. Or Sophia's. She had just been trying to survive. Marco spoke quietly. You hid your past. Yes. Why? Maria looked at Sophia again. Because I didn't want anyone to remember. Marco nodded slowly. But now I do. Maria met his gaze again. Yes. Silence filled the room. Vincent finally spoke. There's still one problem. Maria looked at him. What? If anyone from De Lucas' old network finds out you're alive. Marco finished the sentence calmly. They'll come looking. Maria nodded. I know. Marco looked down at Sophia. The girl slept peacefully, unaware of the dangerous history surrounding the woman she trusted. Vincent spoke again. This complicates things. Marco thought for a moment. Then he said something that shocked both of them. No. Vincent blinked. No? Marco's voice was calm again. It clarifies things. Maria looked confused. How? Marco stepped closer. My daughter didn't choose a maid. Maria's heart pounded. Then what did she choose? Marco looked at Sophia again. She chose someone who protected others, even when it cost her everything. Maria felt tears forming in her eyes. I'm not brave, she whispered. Marco shook his head. You stood up to men most adults fear. Vincent still looked uncertain, but it could still bring danger here. Marco turned toward him slowly. Vincent knew that look. The calm, controlled look that meant Marco Bellini had already made a decision, and nothing would change it. Marco's voice was quiet. If danger comes to this house, his eyes darkened slightly. It won't be leaving. Maria suddenly understood something. Sophia's choice hadn't just changed her life. It had pulled her into a world far more powerful and far more dangerous than the one she had tried to escape. And tomorrow, Marco Bellini would make a decision that would shock the entire city. Morning sunlight spilled across the Bellini mansion like nothing had changed, but inside the house, everything had. Marco Bellini stood in his study, looking out over the long gardens where Sophia was already running through the grass. Maria stood near the stone fountain, laughing softly as Sophia chased a white butterfly. The sound carried all the way through the open window. Marco hadn't heard that laugh in weeks. Behind him, Vincent Russo leaned against the doorframe. You didn't sleep, Vincent said. Marco didn't turn. No, Vincent sighed. This situation is bigger than it looks. Marco finally looked back. Imawar. Vincent walked inside the study. You're about to make a decision that will confuse a lot of powerful people. Marco sat slowly behind his desk. Let them be confused. Vincent folded his arms. You, know what the city expects. Marco raised an eyebrow. They expect you to marry one of those women. Marco gave a faint, almost amused smile. I stopped caring about expectations a long time ago. Vincent didn't argue with that. Instead, he said something more serious. If Maria stays here, she becomes part of your world. Marco nodded. I know, that world is dangerous. Marco looked toward the window again. So is the one she came from. Outside, Sophia tripped in the grass and burst into laughter. Maria helped her up, brushing dirt from her dress. Vincent watched the scene quietly. She's good with the kid, he admitted. Marco's voice softened slightly. She sees her. Vincent looked at him. What about you? Marco didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the garden doors. Vincent followed. They stepped outside together. Sophia spotted them immediately. Papa! She ran toward Marco and wrapped her arms around his leg. Marco lifted her easily. Having fun? Yes! She pointed toward Maria. She was teaching me how to make bread later. Maria looked embarrassed. It's nothing special. Marco looked at her. I've heard otherwise. Maria lowered her eyes. I used to help my grandmother. Sophia tugged Marco's sleeve. So, did I get in trouble yesterday? Marco crouched down so they were eye level. No, then, did I choose wrong? Marco gently placed a hand on her shoulder. No. Sophia's face lit up. Really? Marco nodded. You chose someone who cares, so. About you. Maria shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Bellini. Marco stood again. Walk with me. Maria hesitated, then followed him a few steps away while Sophia played with a garden statue nearby. Maria looked nervous again. If this is about yesterday, I can leave if it makes things easier. Marco studied her quietly. You think that's what this is? I don't want to cause problems for your family. Marco looked toward Sophia again. She already thinks you're family. Maria didn't know what to say. Marco spoke carefully. You risked your life to stand up to dangerous men. Maria shook her head. I just told the truth. Marco nodded slightly. That's rarer than you think. She looked down. I didn't expect any of this. Neither did I. They stood in silence for a moment. Finally, Maria said the thing that had been weighing on her mind all night. You don't actually need a wife. Marco looked at her. No. You're powerful. You already have everything. Marco gave a quiet, thoughtful smile. So, not everything. Maria followed his gaze. Sophia was sitting in the grass, carefully braiding flower stems together. Marco spoke softly. She lost her mother. Maria nodded. I know. And she chose you. Maria swallowed. She deserves someone better. Marco shook his head. She deserves someone real. Maria felt her chest tighten slightly. I'm just a woman who cleans houses. Marco's voice was calm but firm. No. Maria looked at him. You're someone who stayed when a child was hurting. So. Blinked back tears. Marco continued. You're someone who protected others even when it put you in danger. Maria whispered. That was a long time ago. Marco shook his head. It tells me who you are. Maria finally looked up at him fully. What are you saying? Marco didn't rush his answer. For once in his life, Marco Bellini was making a decision that had nothing to do with business, power, or strategy. This was something else, something quieter, something human. My daughter chose you, said. Maria's heart pounded. And what do you choose? She asked softly. Marco looked back toward Sophia, then back at Maria. I choose to trust her. Maria felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them. You barely know me. Marco nodded. That's true. Then why take the risk? Marco's voice lowered. Because Sophia already did. Across the garden, Sophia suddenly ran toward them again. Papa! She stopped between them, holding the flower braid proudly. Look what I made. Marco smiled slightly. It's beautiful. Sophia looked between the two adults nervously. So, what happens now? Maria wiped her eyes quickly. Marco placed a hand gently on Sophia's shoulder. Now, he said calmly, we try something new. Sophia tilted her head. What? Marco looked at Maria, then back at his daughter. We start being a family. Sophia's eyes widened. Really? Marco nodded. Yes. Sophia screamed with excitement and threw her arms around Maria. Maria laughed through her tears. Vincent, watched from the garden steps, shaking his head with a small smile. The most powerful man in the city had just made the most unexpected decision of his life. Not for power, not for influence, but for something far more rare in Marco Bellini's world, trust. As the three of them stood together in the sunlight, the Bellini mansion felt different, warmer, alive again. And for the first time since Elena's death, Marco Bellini realized something surprising. His daughter hadn't just chosen a new mother. She had chosen hope.